The old lady who's paying for everything. That was the line printed neatly beneath Margaret Collins's name, and it was the first thing she saw before she even looked up to find her seat at her granddaughter's wedding. For a brief second, she wondered if she had misread it, if her eyes, now 68 years old, had simply blurred the letters together, but the words stayed exactly where they were, black ink on thick ivory cardstock, centered, deliberate, impossible to mistake. Margaret stood there holding the name tag between her fingers, the soft instrumental music from the string quartet drifting through the ballroom of the country club, the kind of place that charged by the plate and smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Around her, guests laughed, glasses clinked, heels clicked against marble floors, and no one seemed to notice the way her hand tightened just slightly, or the way her shoulders drew back as if her body had decided, without consulting her heart, that it would not bend. She had arrived early, as she always did, wearing a simple navy dress she had chosen weeks ago, careful not to outshine anyone, careful as she had been for most of her life to take up only the space that was offered to her. This wedding mattered to her. Emily was her first grandchild, the one she had rocked to sleep when Pamela needed a break, the one she had paid piano lessons for when Richard said money was tight, the one she had quietly helped through college when scholarships fell short and no one else wanted to talk about numbers. Margaret had written checks without ceremony, transferred funds without conditions, telling herself that family was not an investment you tracked, but something you supported because that was what decent people did. She remembered sitting at her kitchen table months earlier, paperwork spread out in front of her, agreeing to cover the venue deposit, the catering overages, the florist upgrade. Each expense explained to her with bright smiles and phrases like, "Just this once, and it means so much to Emily." She had nodded then too, had smiled then too, because she believed that generosity, when offered without strings, would be returned as respect. Now, standing beneath crystal chandeliers, she realized how wrong that belief had been. The font on the name tag was elegant, professionally printed, not something made in haste or by accident. Someone had approved it. Someone had thought it was clever. Someone had assumed she would laugh along, or worse, say nothing at all. Margaret slowly lifted her gaze. Across the room, Pamela was directing a coordinator, her posture confident, her expression calm, the kind of calm that came from knowing everything was exactly where she wanted it to be. Richard stood nearby, adjusting his tie, avoiding eye contact, already retreating into the familiar safety of not choosing sides. Emily, radiant in white, was surrounded by friends and cameras, blissfully unaware or carefully shielded from anything that might disrupt the image of a perfect day. Margaret felt something settle inside her then, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity. She pinned the name tag to her dress with steady hands. She did not tear it up. She did not demand an explanation. She did not call anyone over. She walked into the reception hall and took her seat, placing her purse neatly at her feet, folding her hands in her lap as if nothing at all were out of place. Guests passed by, some offering polite smiles, some glancing at the tag and looking away too quickly, others reading it and laughing softly before remembering themselves. Each reaction confirmed what the words already had. This was not about humor. It was about position. Margaret was not being thanked. She was being labeled, reduced, defined by what she provided rather than who she was. As the ceremony began, she watched her granddaughter exchange vows, listened to promises about love and respect echo through the room, and understood, with a calm that surprised even her, that this moment was not the beginning of something new, but the end of something old. She would sit through the dinner. She would applaud at the right times. She would smile for photographs if asked. But something fundamental had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way foundations crack without sound. Pamela believed the name tag was a harmless joke. Richard believed silence was neutrality. They were both wrong. Margaret Collins had spent decades giving without keeping score, and today, without raising her voice or leaving her seat, she had finally seen the full bill laid out in front of her. The reception moved forward with practiced precision, plates appearing and disappearing, glasses refilled before they were empty, the low hum of conversation swelling and receding like a tide Margaret had learned to navigate long ago. From her seat near the edge of the room, she observed everything without drawing attention to herself, the way she always had, noting how Pamela floated from table to table accepting compliments as if they were owed, how Richard laughed a little too loudly at jokes he did not finish, how Emily leaned into her new husband with the unguarded trust of someone who believed the people around her would always act with care. Margaret folded her napkin neatly on her lap and listened. She listened to guests talk about the open bar, about the elegance of the venue perched just outside town, about how expensive weddings had become, each comment landing softly, but carrying weight she could feel settle in her chest. Someone nearby mentioned the floral arrangements, admiring how full and abundant they looked, and Margaret remembered the phone call when Pamela had said the standard package felt sparse and asked whether an upgrade would be possible. Just a few $1,000s more, nothing compared to how beautiful it would look in photos. Margaret had agreed then, standing in her kitchen, looking out at a yard she no longer had the energy to maintain, but still paid a gardener to keep respectable, because she did not want Emily to feel she had cut corners on something that mattered. As dinner progressed, she noticed the small, telling moments she had once brushed aside without thought. Pamela did not introduce her to anyone new, even when guests paused at the table and glanced expectantly between them. When a distant relative asked how Margaret knew the bride, Pamela answered quickly, brightly, saying she was Emily's grandmother, as if clarifying a technicality rather than acknowledging a role. Richard passed by twice without stopping, touching the back of his chair briefly, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes, his attention already pulled elsewhere. Margaret responded the same way each time, with a calm nod, a composed expression, never calling him back, never forcing a moment that clearly did not fit into the evening's choreography. She tasted the food but barely registered it, her mind drifting instead to earlier years when family gatherings had been smaller, less polished, but warmer in ways that could not be purchased. She remembered hosting holidays in her own home, setting folding tables when the dining room ran out of space, cooking for days so no one would leave hungry, watching Pamela accept help then without complaint, without irony, grateful rather than entitled. Somewhere between those years in this room, something had changed, not abruptly, but gradually, like a line being crossed so often it eventually disappeared. A woman at the neighboring table leaned over and whispered something to her companion while glancing at Margaret's name tag, and although Margaret could not hear the words, she recognized the look that followed, a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, the look people wore when they sensed something was wrong but did not want to be involved. Margaret met her eyes briefly, offering a polite smile that closed the interaction as firmly as a door. She did not feel the need to explain herself to strangers, not anymore. The speeches began, and Margaret listened as Pamela thanked everyone who had helped make the day possible, listing vendors, planners, friends, even distant relatives who had contributed time or favors, her voice warm, practiced, sincere on the surface. Margaret's name was not mentioned. The omission was clean, intentional, almost elegant in its restraint. She felt no sharp sting at that point, only a quiet confirmation, the kind that left no room for doubt. When the applause faded, Margaret joined in, clapping slowly, steadily, her expression unchanged. She thought of the documents at home, the accounts she managed, the standing transfers she had set up years ago out of habit, not obligation. She thought of how easily generosity could be mistaken for weakness when it was never questioned, never limited, never paired with boundaries. As the evening wore on, Margaret excused herself from the table under the pretense of needing some air, stepping outside onto the terrace where the night was cool and the noise muted. She stood alone for a moment, breathing evenly, the distant sound of laughter drifting through open doors behind her. She was not angry. She was not even hurt in the way she might have been years earlier. What she felt was a settling, a recalibration, the kind that came when illusions fell away and left only facts behind. When she returned inside, she gathered her purse, offered quiet congratulations to Emily, who hugged her tightly without noticing the stillness beneath Margaret's smile, and nodded once to Pamela, who seemed relieved rather than surprised to see her. Preparing to leave, Margaret walked out without fanfare, her heels measured against the pavement, carrying with her not resentment, but understanding, and the certainty that the way she participated in this family was about to change, whether anyone else was ready for it or not. The morning after the wedding arrived quietly, without the urgency or celebration of the night before. and Margaret Collins woke in her own bed to the familiar creak of the house settling as sunlight filtered through thin curtains she had not yet replaced. She moved through her routine with the same precision she always had, brewing coffee, rinsing her mug, standing at the kitchen counter instead of sitting, because sitting invited reflection and she was not ready to linger. The events of the reception did not replay in sharp flashes, but in muted details that surfaced one by one. The weight of the name tag in her hand, the way Pamela's smile never wavered, the ease with which everyone else accepted a joke that required her dignity as its punchline. Margaret opened her checkbook drawer out of habit, then closed it again, aware for the first time of how many habits she had formed to support other people's comfort rather than her own. Later that afternoon, she attended to practical matters, sorting mail, reviewing statements, the quiet administrative tasks that had once felt like background noise but now demanded attention. A catering invoice sat neatly clipped on her desk, marked paid, alongside confirmation emails for floral arrangements and venue rentals, each one a reminder that generosity left a paper trail even when gratitude did not. She did not feel regret. Regret implied a mistake, and Margaret did not believe kindness was a mistake, even when it was mishandled by those who benefited from it. What she felt instead was distance, the kind that allowed observation without emotional interference. That evening, Richard called. The conversation was brief, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a long weekend, his words polite and vague, thanking her for coming, telling her Emily was grateful, assuring her the wedding had been a success. He did not mention the name tag. Margaret did not either. Silence, she had learned, was often more revealing than confrontation. After the call ended, she sat at the dining table alone, the place settings reduced to one, and allowed herself to think back, not just to the wedding, but to the years that had led there. She remembered the first time Pamela had asked for help, framed as a temporary setback, the next time framed as an opportunity, and the many times after that framed as necessity. Each request had been reasonable on its own, each promise of appreciation sincere enough to discourage doubt, until the pattern no longer required explanation. Margaret realized then that the name tag had not created the truth of her role in the family, it had simply announced it out loud. Over the next few days, messages arrived, thank you notes from vendors, automated reminders from the venue, and eventually a carefully worded text from Pamela expressing how wonderful everything had turned out and how much they could not have done it without her. Margaret read the message twice before setting the phone down without replying. She was not angry enough to argue, and not uncertain enough to seek reassurance. Instead, she opened her planner and reviewed commitments she had carried for years without questioning them. Monthly contributions, standing offers of support, open-ended promises made long before circumstances had changed. She crossed nothing out. She simply noted them, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. When she met a friend for lunch later that week, someone who had known her long before Pamela entered the picture, the conversation drifted naturally to the wedding. The friend hesitated before mentioning the reception, choosing her words carefully, admitting that something about the evening had felt uncomfortable, that Margaret had seemed distant, composed in a way that suggested restraint rather than enjoyment. Margaret listened, nodded once, and changed the subject without explanation. She did not need validation. The confirmation had already arrived. That night, she returned home to a quiet house and stood for a moment in the hallway, aware of how much space she had once managed for the sake of others. The walls held memories of holidays, of visits, of times when her presence had been central rather than convenient. She understood now that roles within families were not fixed by love alone, but by boundaries, and that hers had blurred over time until it served everyone but herself. Margaret turned off the lights one by one and went to bed, not with the intention of making a statement, but with the calm certainty that the way she gave, the way she showed up, and the way she allowed herself to be defined would not continue as before. The wedding had been a celebration for others, but for her, it marked a quiet reckoning, one that required no announcements, no raised voices, and no immediate consequences, only patience and a clear understanding of what came next. In the days that followed, Margaret Collins found herself revisiting moments she had once dismissed as minor, replaying them with a clarity that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. She stood in her living room one afternoon, holding a framed photograph of Richard as a child, and remembered the first time Pamela had corrected her in public, gently but firmly, as if establishing a boundary that had not existed before. At the time, Margaret had smiled and stepped back, telling herself that families changed, that roles shifted naturally, that it was better to adapt than to resist. Now, with the distance of hindsight, she could see how often adaptation had meant erasure. She recalled the holiday when Pamela suggested a smaller gathering to reduce stress, only for Margaret to later see photographs of a full table posted online, everyone present except her. She remembered the birthday invitations that arrived late or not at all, the plans she learned about secondhand, the conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. None of these moments had seemed significant enough to address on their own. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Margaret sat at her desk and opened an old notebook where she had once kept track of household expenses when Richard was growing up, flipping through pages filled with careful handwriting and calculations. She had always been meticulous, not because she was frugal, but because she believed responsibility was a form of care. That belief had guided her through marriage, motherhood, and widowhood, through years of showing up quietly where she was needed. Somewhere along the way, care had been redefined by others as obligation, and generosity as entitlement. A letter arrived from the wedding venue thanking her for her contribution and inviting her to consider hosting future events there, complete with glossy photographs and friendly assurances of loyalty discounts. Margaret placed the letter in a drawer without response, noting how easily institutions recognized her value while her own family reduced it to a joke printed on cardstock. She thought of Emily still, on her honeymoon, shielded from these undercurrents by youth and excitement, and felt no resentment toward her. The responsibility lay elsewhere, with the adults who had learned how to accept help without respect, how to laugh at what should have been questioned. When Pamela stopped by unexpectedly one evening, bringing leftover cake and speaking brightly about how tired but happy everyone was, Margaret listened politely, offering tea, asking neutral questions. Pamela talked easily, filling the space with anecdotes and plans, never once mentioning the name tag, never acknowledging the quiet shift she must have sensed but chose not to name. Margaret noticed how comfortable Pamela seemed in her home, how naturally she took up space, how confidently she spoke about future needs, future expenses, future expectations. When Pamela left, thanking her again for everything, Margaret closed the door and stood there for a long moment, aware that gratitude offered after the fact changed nothing about the behavior that made it necessary. That night, Margaret lay awake and considered the difference between being included and being used. She realized that the wedding had not been an isolated incident, but a culmination, a moment where the unspoken became visible. The name tag had not diminished her. It had clarified her position in the eyes of those who placed it there. With that clarity came a sense of resolve she had not felt before. She began to organize her papers, not with urgency, but with intention, separating what was essential from what was habitual. She reviewed commitments she had carried forward automatically, recognizing that continuity was a choice, not a requirement. Margaret did not draft speeches or rehearse confrontations. She did not plan dramatic exits or emotional appeals. Her response would not mirror the carelessness that had wounded her. It would be measured, quiet, and unmistakable in its implications. As she turned off the lamp beside her bed, she understood that reclaiming dignity did not require permission, nor did it require explanation. It required awareness, and the willingness to act differently once awareness arrived. The wedding had provided that, wrapped in elegance and laughter, disguised as celebration. Margaret closed her eyes knowing that what followed would not be loud, but it would be final. The first person to notice the change in Margaret Collins was not Pamela or Richard, but Helen Wright, a retired accountant who had known Margaret for more than 30 years and who recognized subtle shifts the way others noticed weather. They met for coffee on a weekday morning, the kind of standing appointment Margaret rarely canceled, and Helen immediately sensed the difference, not in Margaret's posture or expression, but in the way she listened. Margaret asked questions and waited for full answers, no longer filling silences with reassurance or deflection. As they talked, Helen mentioned the wedding, choosing her words carefully, admitting that she had felt uncomfortable when she saw the place cards. that she had wondered how something so pointed could have passed through so many hands without objection. Margaret did not defend anyone. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the observation without elaboration. That was enough to encourage honesty. Helen spoke then of other things she had noticed over the years, small comments from Pamela about budgets and expectations, remarks that framed Margaret's support as a given rather than a gift. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had once overheard Pamela discussing future plans that assumed Margaret's continued financial involvement, long-term, unquestioned, indefinite. Margaret absorbed this information without visible reaction, filing it alongside everything else that had come into focus since the wedding. After they parted, Margaret returned home and sat at her desk, pulling out a folder she had not opened in years, one that contained notes from meetings with advisors she had trusted when her husband passed away. She reread recommendations she had nodded through at the time, arrangements she had postponed revisiting because nothing had seemed urgent. Now, urgency was replaced by intention. She scheduled a meeting, not to make dramatic changes, but to understand clearly what she had given, and what remained hers to decide. In the days that followed, Margaret went about her life quietly, attending to errands, maintaining routines, speaking politely when spoken to. Pamela sent messages filled with updates and subtle hints, references to upcoming expenses, ideas framed as collaborative plans that assumed agreement. Margaret responded with neutral acknowledgments, never committing, never refusing, allowing space where certainty had once lived. Richard called again, this time mentioning how overwhelming everything felt now that the wedding was over, how grateful he was for Margaret's support, how much they all depended on her steadiness. Margaret listened, offered sympathy, and said little else. She realized that steadiness, as they defined it, meant predictability, and predictability had made her easy to overlook. One afternoon, Margaret sorted through old correspondence and came across handwritten thank you notes from years earlier, from Pamela, from Richard, from Emily, expressing gratitude that felt genuine at the time. She did not dismiss them as false. She understood now that sincerity and respect were not the same, and that one did not guarantee the other. The wedding had simply removed the final layer of ambiguity. Helen called later that week to check in, her tone gentle but direct, asking whether Margaret was all right. Margaret answered honestly, saying she was clearer than she had been in a long time. Helen did not ask for details. She did not need them. The clarity showed in Margaret's voice, in its calm, measured cadence. That evening, Margaret reviewed her calendar and noticed how many future commitments revolved around supporting others rather than herself. She did not cancel them all. She marked them, considered them, weighed each one without the pressure of expectation. The shift was internal, but its effects would be tangible. She understood now that waiting for acknowledgement from people who benefited from her silence would lead nowhere. Respect was not requested. It was enforced through boundaries. As she prepared for bed, Margaret felt no rush to confront anyone, no desire to expose or accuse. Her response would unfold gradually, through absence where presence had been assumed, through limits where access had been unrestricted. The wedding had revealed who counted on her compliance. The days after had revealed who noticed her dignity. Margaret closed the light knowing that allies did not always announce themselves loudly, and that sometimes the most powerful change began not with confrontation, but with one person finally choosing to see clearly and act accordingly. By the second week after the wedding, the absence of Margaret Collins's automatic compliance had begun to register, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a quiet inconvenience that unsettled the rhythm others relied on. Pamela noticed it first when a casual message about an upcoming home repair went unanswered for an entire afternoon, something that had never happened before. Margaret eventually replied with a polite acknowledgement, neither agreeing nor offering assistance, her words neutral and complete in themselves. Pamela read the message twice, sensing something unfamiliar in its restraint, a lack of the reassurance she had come to expect. Richard, too, felt the shift when he mentioned an idea over the phone, speaking loosely about future plans that involved travel, expenses, and shared responsibility, only to receive a thoughtful pause instead of immediate support. Margaret listened, asked clarifying questions, and said she would think about it, a phrase she had rarely used in the past. The change was subtle enough to be dismissed at first, but consistent enough to feel deliberate. Margaret herself experienced the difference internally as a recalibration rather than a withdrawal. She continued to attend family events when invited, continued to answer calls, continued to show interest in Emily's life, but she no longer stepped in to anticipate needs that had not been clearly expressed. When Pamela spoke about costs in abstract terms, Margaret responded with interest rather than solutions. When Richard hinted at financial stress, Margaret offered empathy without remedies. The space she created was not hostile. It was simply no longer filled by default. One afternoon, Margaret received a detailed email from Pamela outlining several upcoming expenses, framed as shared decisions that needed prompt confirmation. Margaret read it carefully, noting the assumptions woven into the language, the way responsibility was distributed without consent. She drafted a response, concise and measured, stating that she would not be able to contribute at that time and wished them well in making arrangements. She sent it without explanation. The reply from Pamela came quickly, surprised but composed, thanking her for letting them know, adding that they would figure something out. Margaret sensed the adjustment happening in real time, the recalculation of expectations that had gone unexamined for years. She felt no triumph in this, only a steady sense of alignment between her actions and her understanding. Later that week, Helen called to invite her to dinner, mentioning that she had sensed some tension during a recent conversation with Pamela, who had seemed unusually careful with her words. Margaret listened without comment, neither confirming nor denying, content to let others draw their own conclusions. She understood now that explaining herself would only reopen discussions she had already resolved internally. Her clarity did not require consensus. As days passed, Margaret found her time opening up in unexpected ways. She revisited interests she had set aside, attended a lecture at the local library, took longer walks in the morning without checking her phone. The absence of constant requests revealed how much energy she had been spending to maintain a role that no longer fit her sense of self. She noticed that when she did choose to help, the act felt different, deliberate rather than obligatory, a gift rather than a reflex. Pamela's communications grew more formal, more cautious, the familiarity replaced by politeness that bordered on uncertainty. Richard, too, adjusted, expressing gratitude more explicitly, perhaps sensing that appreciation now mattered in ways it had not before. Margaret observed these changes without comment, aware that boundaries often revealed character more clearly than generosity ever had. She did not frame her decisions as punishment or retaliation. She saw them as correction, a return to balance after years of quiet imbalance. The wedding had been a moment of exposure, but the response was unfolding gradually, shaped by consistency rather than confrontation. Margaret understood that the absence of drama did not diminish the significance of what was happening. If anything, it made it more difficult to challenge. There was nothing to argue against, no accusation to deflect, only a new normal that required adjustment. As she prepared dinner one evening, cooking for herself without the distraction of planning for others, Margaret felt a calm satisfaction settle in. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply stopped filling a space that was never meant to be empty unless someone else chose to step into it with respect. And in that quiet withdrawal, she recognized a form of strength she had not known she possessed. The shift became unmistakable during a Sunday lunch Richard invited Margaret to attend, an invitation phrased carefully, as if he were testing whether she would accept under new terms. Margaret arrived on time, carrying nothing but herself, no desserts prepared in advance, no envelopes tucked discreetly into her purse. The house felt different to her now, not hostile, but unfamiliar, as though the expectations embedded in its walls had been quietly rearranged. Pamela greeted her with a smile that lingered a fraction too long, a smile that waited for something that did not arrive. Margaret returned it politely and took her seat, observing without comment as conversation unfolded. Pamela spoke about recent expenses with deliberate vagueness, referencing adjustments and compromises, glancing occasionally toward Margaret as if expecting recognition or response. Margaret listened, nodded once, and continued eating, her attention steady, her demeanor unchanged. Richard noticed. He cleared his throat, shifted topics, then circled back, mentioning how challenging things had become without the extra support they had once relied on. Margaret met his eyes and acknowledged the difficulty without offering solutions. The silence that followed was brief but instructive. Pamela filled it quickly, laughing lightly, assuring everyone they were managing just fine. The laughter did not quite land. After lunch, as dishes were cleared and coffee poured, Pamela asked Margaret to step into the kitchen, her tone cordial, her words careful. She spoke about family, about how much Margaret meant to them, about how misunderstandings could arise when people felt unappreciated. Margaret listened without interruption, recognizing the shape of the conversation, how it leaned toward reassurance without apology. When Pamela paused, Margaret thanked her for sharing and said she understood, adding that she had also spent time reflecting on her own role and needs. She did not explain further. Pamela nodded, uncertain, sensing that the exchange had not gone as expected. Richard watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. On the drive home, Margaret felt neither shaken nor vindicated. The conversation had confirmed what she already knew, that her boundaries were being felt, even if not yet fully understood. Over the next few weeks, invitations continued, accompanied by a new awareness in tone and timing. Requests were framed more directly, no longer cloaked in assumption. Margaret responded thoughtfully, choosing when to participate and when to decline, her decisions guided by intention rather than habit. Emily called once, eager to share updates from married life, her voice bright and affectionate. Margaret listened warmly, offering advice when asked, encouragement when needed, without the undercurrent of obligation that had once colored every interaction. She was careful to protect that relationship, to ensure that clarity did not harden into distance where innocence remained. Pamela, however, grew increasingly measured, her messages shorter, her expectations recalibrated. Margaret recognized the adjustment as progress, however uncomfortable. One afternoon, Helen visited and remarked on the change she sensed during a recent encounter with the family, noting how Pamela seemed more restrained, how Richard appeared more attentive. Margaret smiled slightly, acknowledging without elaboration. She understood now that influence did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a recalibration others could not ignore. As autumn approached, Margaret reviewed her plans for the coming months, making choices that reflected her priorities rather than inherited responsibilities. She scheduled a trip she had postponed for years, enrolled in a course she had once dismissed as impractical, rearranged her home to suit herself rather than accommodate guests who no longer visited freely. Each decision reinforced the same truth, that her life was hers to shape, not a resource to be allocated by others. The family adjusted accordingly, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Conversations grew more honest, gratitude more explicit, requests more respectful. Margaret did not mistake these changes for transformation. She knew habits could resurface if boundaries softened. Still, she recognized the value of what had been achieved without confrontation, without spectacle. The wedding had revealed a truth she could no longer unsee, and her response had allowed that truth to reshape her relationships on her terms. As she settled into the rhythm of her days, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction not rooted in being needed, but in being respected, a distinction she had learned too late to ignore, but early enough to claim. By the time winter settled in, the changes Margaret Collins had made were no longer invisible, even to those who preferred not to acknowledge them. The family gathered less frequently now, not because of conflict, but because the unspoken structure that once held everything together had shifted. When they did meet, the atmosphere was quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone were learning new rules without ever writing them down. Margaret arrived when invited and left when it suited her, no longer lingering to smooth over awkward pauses or anticipate needs that had not been voiced. She noticed how Pamela chose her words more carefully, how requests were framed with explicit questions rather than assumptions, how gratitude was expressed earlier instead of after the fact. These changes did not erase what had happened, but they altered what followed, and that distinction mattered. One evening, as Margaret prepared for a short trip she had planned months earlier, she received a message from Richard asking if they could talk. The call was different from those that had come before. His tone was slower, less practiced, as if he were choosing honesty over efficiency. He spoke about stress, about adjusting to new responsibilities, about realizing how much he had relied on her presence without fully considering its cost. Margaret listened, neither interrupting nor reassuring, allowing him to finish without softening the edges of his realization. When he paused, she acknowledged his words and said she appreciated his thoughtfulness. She did not rush to forgive or to promise anything in return. The conversation ended with mutual understanding rather than resolution, and Margaret recognized that as progress. During her trip, she found herself enjoying the absence of constant communication, the freedom of days shaped by her own interests. She walked through unfamiliar streets, attended events she had once postponed indefinitely, and noticed how easily her life expanded when it was no longer organized around being available. She returned home rested, not because the trip had been extraordinary, but because it had been uninterrupted. Pamela reached out shortly after, sharing updates and asking how the trip had been, her tone polite, her questions genuine. Margaret responded warmly, sharing details without embellishment, comfortable in the balance they were finding. She sensed that Pamela was recalibrating, learning to engage without leaning, to relate without extracting. Whether that adjustment would last remained to be seen, but Margaret no longer felt responsible for sustaining it. As the months passed, Emily visited more often on her own, seeking advice, sharing experiences, building a relationship that felt unburdened by expectation. Margaret cherished these moments, careful to offer support without overreach, to listen without directing. She understood now how easily love could become transactional when boundaries blurred, and she was determined not to repeat that pattern. Pamela observed these interactions from a distance, perhaps reassessing her assumptions, perhaps simply adapting to a new dynamic. Margaret did not speculate. She focused instead on maintaining consistency, knowing that clarity required reinforcement through action rather than explanation. When invitations arrived for future gatherings, Margaret responded thoughtfully, attending some, declining others, her decisions guided by interest rather than obligation. Each choice reinforced the same message without ever stating it aloud. She was present because she chose to be, not because she was expected to fill a role. The family adjusted accordingly, slowly accepting a version of Margaret who was neither diminished nor endlessly accommodating. There were moments of discomfort, of misalignment, but also moments of genuine connection that felt cleaner, less encumbered by unspoken debts. Margaret understood that the reckoning prompted by the wedding had not been about punishment or withdrawal. It had been about restoration, about returning dignity to a place where it had quietly eroded. She did not seek acknowledgement for the change, nor did she need apologies to validate it. The difference was evident in the way conversations unfolded, in the respect that now preceded requests, in the absence of assumptions that once defined her role. As she settled into this new phase of her life, Margaret felt grounded in a sense of self that no longer depended on being indispensable. The celebration that had exposed the truth had also given her the opportunity to reclaim herself, not through confrontation, but through deliberate choice, a resolution that continued to shape every interaction that followed. The following spring arrived with a sense of quiet completion, not marked by announcements or reconciliations, but by the steady normalization of a life no longer shaped around proving worth. Margaret Collins noticed it one morning as she sat at her kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood beneath her hands, realizing that she no longer checked her phone first thing to see who might need her. The family remained part of her life, but no longer its organizing principle. Invitations came with clearer intentions. Conversations unfolded without the careful negotiation that once defined them, and when she declined, her decision was accepted without argument. Pamela adapted fully by then, her interactions respectful, her expectations grounded, no longer assuming access to Margaret's time or resources. Richard, too, had grown quieter, more thoughtful, expressing appreciation without urgency, perhaps understanding at last that gratitude offered after boundaries were drawn carried a different weight. Emily continued to visit, their relationship marked by ease rather than obligation, a connection strengthened by the absence of unspoken debts. Margaret valued that most of all, the ability to love without leverage. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, she came across the name tag she had tucked away months earlier, the cardstock slightly bent at the corners, the ink still bold. She held it for a moment, not with resentment, but with recognition, understanding how a single object had clarified years of imbalance more effectively than any conversation could have. She placed it back in the drawer, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as evidence of a turning point she did not need to revisit. The family gathered again later that year for a small celebration, modest in scale, unremarkable to anyone outside it. Margaret attended without hesitation, greeted warmly, treated with a courtesy that felt genuine rather than performative. There were no jokes at her expense, no assumptions woven into conversation, no subtle tests of how much she would offer. She contributed where she chose, participated where she wished, and left when she was ready. No one objected. The equilibrium held. Margaret understood then that dignity did not require acknowledgement from those who once overlooked it. It required consistency from herself. The wedding that had exposed the truth had also revealed her capacity for restraint, for patience, for change enacted without spectacle. She had not demanded apologies or explanations. She had simply stepped back and allowed others to adjust to her absence from a role she no longer accepted. In doing so, she had reclaimed a version of herself she had nearly forgotten, one defined not by what she provided, but by who she was when she chose to engage. As she settled into the rhythms of her days, Margaret felt neither hardened nor withdrawn. She felt precise. Her generosity, when offered, was intentional. Her presence, when given, was genuine. The family, reshaped by this clarity, moved forward with a new understanding, one that would not erase the past, but would prevent its repetition. Margaret did not frame the experience as loss or victory. She saw it as alignment, a necessary correction after years of quiet compromise. The celebration that once reduced her to a label had ultimately returned her to herself, not through confrontation, but through resolve, a conclusion that required no audience to be complete.